thank you again for your time that you decided to join this webinar. And it's a great pleasure for me to start this webinar. So first of all, good afternoon if you're in Europe, and good morning if you're somewhere in the United States or even in Latin America, and probably a good evening if you're in Asia, such as China, those countries. So we have very diverse participants that I see for the list. So today is the first introductory webinar on a topic of agricultural land abandonment. And the presentation is entitled Agricultural Land Abandonment as a Global Land Use Change Phenomenon. So this webinar is a part of the interdisciplinary activity within the auspice of the Global Land Program and the group which has been created, Global Land Abandonment as a Global Land Use Change Phenomenon. And some of you, I see they are active members of this group and some are new faces, so you are more than welcome. And the aim of this group, what we preliminarily outline, is to better understand the role of the individual decision-making and behavioral factors, that also better understand the progression on the mapping and measuring abandonment. Also to study the role of the rural-urban transition in relationship to abandonment process, alternatives to agricultural reuse of formerly cultivated lands, and also to better understand the design of the policies, but also to foster, which supposed to retire these lands, but also maybe reuse these lands. So how the policies are working, and surely also about the environmental and societal impacts resulting also in a food security or in insecurity. And more thematically, since there's been quite some work done on global north, we would like also to progress and to understand the works in the global south. Oops, I hear my echo, but it's fine. Few words about us. So first of all, about the coordinators of the group. Some are with us and some they are not. And let me start from the first coordinator, Dr. Miroslava Bavarova. She is from Czech University of the Life Sciences in Czech Republic, and she is working more on behavioral economics in agriculture, including the land use change and agricultural land abandonment. The second coordinator, Simone Gradinaro, she is from the University of Bucharest, and she is working on a peri-urban interface and topics on food security, including abandonment. Third, our coordinator, Dr. Hein from Kent State University in the United States, is working in the field of the land system science, working on the land abandonment and using remote sensing as a technique to study this process. The fourth, our coordinator, Suresh Chaudhary, he is from Nepal, and he probably one of the among us has the most of the knowledge on abandonment processes in Nepal, where he did a lot of studies on the land abandonment. And sure, a little bit I will tell about myself as a fifth person a little bit later, but just, my name is Alexander Prishepov. I'm coming from the University of Copenhagen. I work in the field of the land system science, land abandonment, and also using different techniques to study this process. We welcome other coordinators. We probably miss still some people from the social science perspective and maybe some other fields. Our group working members so far, you see quite a lot of people in the group, and we just had our meetings a couple of days ago where we got to know each other. And if you would like to join this group, you're more than welcome to do so via the glp.earth, via official webpage, to become a member of this group. So the planned activities in this webinar is a part of these activities. We would like to have a series of the webinars about abandonment topic and complexity to study this process. Also engagement in a discussion, working on working papers, running maybe to organize PhD summer schools, to look at the case studies and maybe to have a field visits, to look from the different angles on the process of abandonment, but also informing each other about the new publications which appear on this topic, cross-sectoral activities or cross-cutting activities, joint elaboration, supporting grant applications, writing the paper. So that's all about to have us all together as a group. We will communicate information via GLP website and mailing list, but you can also find the information on a Facebook group on the land abandonment, so land abandonment group. And also we communicate information via GLP abandonment WG. So you're more than welcome to join. So we can send some information about relevant events, conferences, workshops related to the topic where we are going to have some sessions, and also relevant new papers about that. And also tweeting, for sure, we're also tweeting with this hashtag that we have now. So shortly about me, what I mentioned that my name is Alexander or Sasha Prishepov. I'm originally from Russia and did my studies in the United States and postdoc in Germany on the land system science, and actually quite a lot of work on the land abandonment. I'm associate professor at the University of Copenhagen in the land system science with a focus on understanding the sustainable land use pathways. And I do quite a bit of work on the land abandonment, both on the drivers, but also mapping the patterns of abandonment and applications of this process. And just few publications from this year I listed here for your reference, both on the distribution of abandonment and intention to recultivate the lands. So if you have some questions, if you would like to get some feedback, I will be always happy to communicate. You can do it. So, but it's not about me, it's about us. And let me start as a motivation, discussing about topic of abandonment. And as a motivation, I bring the slide about global deforestation. Yeah, this is a process which is probably has some also emotional connection. That if we hear something about deforestation, what kind of emotional perception do we have? By looking at the map with a lot of red dots, which indicate ongoing deforestation globally, and more a little bit zooming in, we observe this kind of the fishbone pattern. Yeah, and we see some vanishing forests. We see a lot of things which probably disturbed us. Yeah, and we probably have bad connotation about this process. But what about abandonment? If to look about, for instance, on the left side, on a picture from one of my fieldworks in a temperate Russia, we observe a natural recovery of the vegetation. So it's probably something good. Yeah, we may consider the vegetation is being restored where it used to be the fields were cultivated. So maybe this would be a positive connotation. But if we will consider that this vegetation, non-native alien species, we will have a very different perception of this process. Similarly, by looking at the right part of the slide, abandonment to the settlements, and this is example from Himalayan in India. If we see abandonment of the settlements, as a land planners or policymakers, they will be probably unhappy about that. So it may have actually opposite, a negative process. So in that, what it brings, and what I would like to highlight, that abandonment compared to the deforestation may have a very different perception, surely about the place, but also emotional perception. And this also becomes quite challenging to study and compare this process from one place to another. Another slide from motivation, and sorry, maybe I stole one of the ideas how to present, communicate material from my former PhD supervisor, Dr. Volker Radulov. Just consider yourself, you walk on a street, and on a sidewalk, you notice that there is a banknote, $1. So something is neglected, and you may pick this money, may not leave as it was. And if you pick this money, you probably may search for the person who may potentially lose this money, or alternatively placing on a banking account, not necessarily maybe $1 bill, but still, or to go maybe to buy ice cream or something else, immediately spend this money. So that shows that with this money, what we find in the street, we can do a lot of things, either neglect, abandon, or use in a different pathways. The same may probably also apply to the abandonment, the lands which are staying idle, neglected, that they can stay idle or can be reused in the future. And that it shows that compared to deforestation, where something has been cleared, and it has maybe one type of the transformation. Here we have multiple transitions for these lands and potential reuse. As outline of today's discussion, we'll shortly look about abandonment as a global phenomenon by looking at the historical insights and land use legacies. We will go through the definition of land abandonment, its complexity, how can we measure agricultural land abandonment, conceptual frameworks to study abandonment as a process, and abandonment as a syndrome, and many other considerations through the theoretical understanding of this process. This could be also a motivation to study abandonment, that if we look at the statistics, population statistics, we observe population increase, but also increase of the cultivated lands. So population grows, and hand in hand it goes with agricultural expansion, but also results in vanishing remaining intact areas. But simultaneously, if we look at the agricultural statistics, starting from 1960s, if we take into the account and use food and agricultural statistics, we notice that in many parts of the world, we observe both increase, but also decrease of cultivated lands. So in some areas, we have a continuum decline, such as in Europe, Western Europe, and some areas in Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, we have a steep decline in cultivated lands. But also, since it's a net gain and net loss of the lands, we also notice that probably we have both processes going hand in hand. And we, as most of us were geographers, we work with the maps. If everything took place in a map, we start noticing that, first of all, there are some hotspots of abandonment, that we have former Soviet Union countries. They form probably a bulk or chunk of this abandoned lands or declined cultivated lands since 1960s, based on the FAO statistics. Also the United States, Europe, so that's probably well documented. But surprisingly, we also observe abandonment in those areas which are kind of the land scarce and populous: China, India, Iran, and other countries where abandonment is a common phenomenon too, for quite some reasons. I should admit that very few statistics, they record abandonment, is a statistics by itself, and rather we use some proxies to measure abandonment, such as the cropland decline. We know there are some case studies, but unfortunately, until these days, we don't have some systematic surveys of abandoned lands globally. And that actually shows us a very important gap in existing studies, that the distribution of the land abandonment globally, maybe compared to the deforestation, there are quite a lot of studies. It's quite blurry. We don't really know the actual patterns of abandonment. Why it's so important to study abandonment? Well, there are different various impacts on the biodiversity. It may result in a defragmentation of the landscapes, opportunities for the rewilding, but also can be a source for the invasive species. Impact has impact on the hydrology, spread of the wildfires, livelihoods, so, and also food security that we should also consider that it may impact. I'm bringing another slide also related to the one of the past works, that if we consider about greenhouse gas emissions, so the abandoned lands, they serve as a very important source for the carbon storage globally, and one of the important carbon sinks. And carbon goes wild. Let's call it in this way. So the longer we keep the lands not cultivated, more carbon it will be stored either in the soil or in above ground biomass. But looking at the right part of the slide, we notice that some areas we know with the red is a deforestation, but also we see with the blue, or basically accumulation of the carbon in above ground biomass for from 1993 to 2012. And we notice some hotspots: China, Northern Eurasia, so former Soviet Union countries. A lot of carbon has been stored on these lands. So shortly to mention, to conclude, that abandoned lands actually are playing an important and vital role, especially in discussion about the combating climate change, about the carbon storage and possibilities to store the carbon on the formerly cultivated lands. We discuss about 1960s and 2020 to 2021, and we always have some kind of the feeling that it's some new phenomenon. And this is where I'm questioning. And in fact, and what we see from the literature, abandonment is not a new phenomenon. And we notice for the literature that there have been cases of abandonment in the past, and it was always going through the history of the humans. I'm bringing an example of the Jared Diamond's work on how societies choose to fail or survive. And he brought a hypothesis how a combination of the institutions exhausting natural fertility and climate change resulted in a collapse of the Maya civilization, which went hand in hand with the land abandonment. And now we see a lot of forests there. So maybe someone would consider it was a kind of a small, but in fact it was large in that context of the population that was quite widespread, large process. A little bit going further through the history and looking at the example of the European history, we had impacts of the epidemics. Well, now we're in the COVID times, it's not as pronounced, but also disturbed some transformations in, let's say, the trade flows. But looking at the Black Death, in that period, 30 to 60% of the European population was wiped out, which resulted also in abandonment and reforestation of some areas which never been recultivated further. A little bit moving also through the history, we notice that also impacts of the wars and catastrophes shaped land use. And for instance, the 30 Years' War, which went through the center of Europe, when some states that were formed, and also some clashing of the religions and the way how the people interpret the Christ, caused a lot of tensions and a lot of armed conflicts in this 30-year war period. And in that period, 25 to 40% of the population has been reduced across the German states. In that time, Germany was not as one uniform country, rather separate dukeships and some smaller dukeships and so on, so who also competed, but also there've been wars rolling over. So that example, for instance, is bringing the example of this painting of the ranks, the looting of the for the landscape. It resulted, of course, looting in cities, but also in the countrysides, where the people also were afraid to go in the fields to be killed. And there are a lot of parallels with this ongoing wars these days in contemporary world. Well, let's move a little bit more into the kind of the recent history. And I would like, to start with a slide from the publication of the John Foley about conceptualizing land transitions. So the idea was that we have a natural frontiers, ecosystems. Over the development of the society, some areas are cleared, and then over the time, areas are intensified with the use. And then there is some point where some lands can be actually spared because the productivity has been increased, so there is no need anymore to cultivate more lands. And that point results in a forest gain. So coming from the forest loss to the forest gain, so forest transition, or points with the transition. And sometimes it's also called forest transition theory, so how this forest transition is linked to the different societal and economic transitions. And by looking at the right slide, we notice that many areas in Europe and also in other parts of the world, they experienced already this type of the transition. So from forest loss to the forest gain, and quite often also the abandonment relationship to the abandonment of agricultural lands. If you look more into these details, then you will notice that Central Europe experienced already early 20th century massive abandonment. So to summarize and conclude that here, that once we discuss about abandonment, that something is new, in fact, it's not a new process. It has been taking place in the past too, and we probably can learn something about this process by looking at the drivers and implications of this abandonment in order to make some parallels with ongoing process these days. You may ask now, what is actually abandonment, agricultural land abandonment? And probably we always connect that something what has been cultivated and then has been left from the cultivation, left for nature. And this is also becoming super challenging to study abandonment compared to deforestation, where it's probably a very uniform definition that there was a forest and then has been cleared. Even by looking at the definition of the Food and Agriculture Organization, it tells us about the cessation of the farming, which could be grassland or cropland, resulting in the natural restoration of the vegetation or degradation of farmland facilities. So here we have some kind of dichotomy. On one side, we have natural restoration and another degradation. If to measure these processes, we'll probably have a very different outcomes. Another complexity also comes from other type of the definitions where the temporal extent is placed. So how long the field was not cultivated in order to consider that being abandoned. So example could be idle plots without the signs of cultivation up to 3 years, according to European Environmental Agency. And other countries, they have their own definitions, but also you may consider different agricultural systems when you could consider that this field is truly abandoned. So the definition of abandonment, in fact, varies from the country to country and influenced by various factors, such as the legislation, perception of the abandonment, but also the ability to measure this process, both in the ground, but also maybe using other techniques, such as a satellite remote sensing. Another complexity comes once we study the process of abandonment about the definition. We talk about abandonment, but by looking at the literature, you probably notice that there have been other definitions, such as old fields. It was term used quite some time in 90s and 2000s, and so very commonly used old fields in the ecological literature among the environmental scientists, rather social scientists. There might be idle fields, also set aside fields, fallow fields. But fallow fields can be also as a part of the crop rotation, as a way to naturally replenish the nutrients in the soil. So through the clean or the green fallowing, not necessarily abundant plants. I'm coming originally from Russia. And once I look at the literature, I noticed the Russian colleagues, they use the term post-agrogenic. So something what comes after agriculture, a term commonly used across the former Soviet Union countries, also among the environmental scientists. If I look at the definitions of abandonment from other colleagues and research schools, for instance, from the South Africa, I noticed that there are terms such as uncultivated or deactivated fields are commonly used too. But also in Europe, some scientists, they use marginal fields or even underused fields. And these are common terms as well. So that also brings not only complexity, but also an important question: how can we actually compare abandonment under these definitions? Or if any truly uniform definition exists in order to compare study sites across different areas? So that's a rather open question for our discussion, rather to be for me to answer now. So that exactly posed a challenge, a complexity to study this process. What is also quite important, how abandonment looks at the ground. So the stage and timing and land cover on abandoned lands induce also the complexity to study this process. And I bring the work from Natalia Kolechka, the scientist. She's working on measuring abandonment. If we stay in the field, we come to the field, we probably notice the different stages of the vegetation of the field we know was abandoned. And if it's in a temperate Europe, it may be first after the croplands are coming some weeds, later some maybe native grasses, then the shrubs, then younger trees, and maybe after 100 years, we'll have some climax. So depending when exactly we enter into the system, we will have different conditions and stages of abandonment. That also brings an important question, how actually accurately we can define and measure the timing when field was abandoned and also the duration of abandonment. We all come from different parts of the world, and I bring also about the complexity of the study in abandonment. These pictures collected from different parts of this world on abandonment process. The upper left side shows that the field was cultivated in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and after it has been abandoned, it actually more represents still the bare soil with some kind of the vegetation coming. So very little kind of the changes maybe from the remote sensing perspective. Another picture is more on the right side, top right side. So you see the abandonment of the orchards. It's in a temperate Europe that some shrubs and grasses intercept between the orchards, and could be also difficult to measure, and shows also another way also how it may appear. The slide a little bit more to the left, but bottom corner, you notice another complexity. It's abandonment of the date production. I did this picture during the field trip in Iran. So maybe from the remote sensing perspective, it will also present some challenge to really define this as truly abundant areas if we are not on the ground, if we don't use a contextual information, but also presents the presence of different types of vegetation. And now another also extreme, that abandonment of the vast croplands and converted into the grasslands, so abandonment in the steppes, for instance, in Russia and Kazakhstan, where this endless grassland landscape appears. So that also shows very different also in terms of the productivity, biomass production, appearance, floral composition, and that surely makes it quite difficult to study and measure this process from the different parts of the world. So surely that poses an important question, how we can actually accurately measure this abandonment in different parts of the world and how methods can work in order to compare these processes. I discussed about measuring of abandonment, and we can use the statistics in the surveys and also the field methods, point observations. We can use a satellite remote sensing data these days, aerial photos and historical maps. I will not talk much about the measuring of abandonment because we will have a separate seminar or webinar on this topic in upcoming months, so that you can learn more and we can discuss more about, we can actually more learn from each other, rather to say that you will learn something from us. Once we measure something regarding abandonment, we surely would like to conceptualize, and we have some theories, and that's for that we will also have a separate seminar, webinar on theoretical ground behind the abandonment process, but also how we can measure the drivers, which drivers has been studied or not. In principle, shortly speaking, usually we have some predisposing biophysical site conditions, such as infrastructure, agricultural intensification, farmland extraction, or for instance, like environmental drivers. And I bring elaboration of our coordinator, Suresh Chaudhary, who reworked on the concept of the Geist and Lambin on approximate and underlying causes. And the actual underlying causes behind of abandonment can be still as a socio-demographic factors. You probably may link with the population decline or out migration, economic factors. If the costs for the production, they are not kind of covered by the revenues or gains from the selling the products, and also technological factors. Some fields can be abandoned because there is a lack of the agricultural equipment, but also can be opposite process. If there is a agricultural equipment is there, so then you don't need to cultivate more lands, rather more to intensify the production on a fewer plots. Policy institutional factors, they play a crucial role. If some, let's say, unclaimed lands and unresolved land tenures, they may result in an abandonment process, but also cultural factors, so behavioral factors. And there is quite a bit ongoing work about these processes. And surely also predisposing by physical site conditions and the locational characteristics. Some factors that we have studied quite a lot, and some that we are not. And this is where we kind of trying also to question ourselves, do we really understand all these drivers and do all this, or also if we link all these potential drivers, how they can all interact among each other, which kind of the techniques we can use in order to better understand the driving processes, but also which ways we can collect certain type of information and which level in order, for instance, to study the cultural factors or some other factors as well. And for that, again, we will have a separate webinar. We will spend more time and freely chat about different experiences, also studying the process, which approaches do exist, which are working well, which are not. One of the essential topics in studying agricultural land abandonment process is that we should consider that, probably we should consider, or maybe not, that this process can be linked or interlinked both locally, but also in a global context. And I just bring more slide for some inspiration for to kind of support of our understanding. If to look at the A, and we see the tree canopy change, canopy cover change. So we observe the canopy increase or the gain in northern latitudes. And in the southern latitudes, we observe opposite. We observe canopy loss, if we say global canopy. So that means that if we have forest gain, which we link with the canopy gain in more in the temperate regions, particularly maybe the Europe and former Soviet Union countries, the United States, and we observe opposite loss of the vegetation more in a global south, that these processes most likely they are linked. But of course, it's very important to understand how we can study these processes and how well we can understand the driving mechanisms, because quite often we measure the drivers in one specific area, but we don't consider in the telecoupled systems the distant factors and how the factors which are operating in some distance, where they impact the process of abandonment in a specific area. We often discuss about abandonment, but abandonment can be actually linked to the other processes, so going hand in hand and forming the syndromes. Bring just as inspiration maybe some of the potential syndromes. I'm not saying this is the true, but rather is a plausible syndrome is a rural exodus and agricultural abandonment, often linked also with the out-migration. Example, the Himalaya in India on the left side. Another extreme example is the droughts and agricultural land abandonment in droughts with the climate change or some weather change with the patterns. It's an example of the Dust Bowl in 1930s in the United States, where the soils were degraded and soil was blown away. So the people simply had to abandon these activities and left the areas. So these processes also can be interlinked all together, and that's quite important to understand these syndromes. Coming in the next, we often as a geographers or maybe economists or people who use the remote sensing, we probably still miss quite a lot of quite some work from the cultural geography aspects. And we always may measure certain things, maybe using satellite techniques, but in fact, if we are on the ground, we can already observe some signs of the abandonment. Bring the context of a European landscape or American landscape, that sometimes you enter certain villages, for instance, upper right picture from Italy. If you're in a village, you can notice that maybe some school is closed, then shops are going to be closed, or like gas stations, they are closed, there are some other facilities. So early signs of kind of the decay of the agricultural infrastructure, rural infrastructure, which may result also to abandoning the lands and population exodus, and maybe not. And this kind of brings very interesting also context of reading the landscapes in order to understand the abandonment process. That's also quite important topic, which also we may also consider with the agricultural abandonment, is the process of the change in the societal transitions. Yeah, with the I'm bringing an example, for instance, from the South Africa, that we have agricultural areas, we have rural settlements, but people may not necessarily over the time being dependent anymore on agricultural areas and being interested or engaged in agricultural activities. With rural-urban transformation, some people may move or some family members to the cities, and the families can still stay in the countryside and living from their offsets. They even can go to the supermarkets because they receive, let's say, sufficient money. They don't need to cultivate the lands. They can also work in alternative to agriculture services, such as the provision of the tourism services. And that brings a really interesting context that the people may live on agricultural land, but not live from this land. So not necessarily be engaged in this production. So one is, of course, important question comes, okay, how does this agricultural land abandonment is related to the change of their livelihood and livelihood strategies of the people, but also how does may have impact on people's security, on food insecurity. If we not cultivate certain lands, maybe where the fields are large and more commercial farming with the exports of the grain, for instance, in Russia, Kazakhstan, probably it does not impact food security in this particular area. But if the lands where the smallholder farmers, they appear, they are not cultivated, perhaps it does have some impact on food security as well. It's a rather question, rather some statement. So please consider in this way. This is probably one of the last slides I would like to bring as a point also of the discussion. If we compare to other processes, such as the urbanization or deforestation, where it can be a kind of the terminal process. So if deforestation, something is deforested and hopefully it will be reforested again. With agricultural land abandonment, it's a transition process. So we measure something on time that land is not cultivated, but we not necessarily expect that this land will stay like that for the rest of their, let's say, time. So there are multiple opportunities for reuse of this land over the time, such as urban expansion, using for game areas or protected areas, or for even reuse for agriculture. So different trajectories. And this is something what we also probably, it's really interesting to understand and important to understand. It creates also the challenge to understand these processes of transformation over that time. And I bring an example of the work from the Darla Munro on this topic. So in summary, and kind of the points for the out discussion is about what other challenges do exist to study abandonment. Can we uniformly define and truly compare these all case studies? Do we observe or predict the new hotspots of abandonment? Again, we discussed a lot and we got a lot of ideas about abandonment process in Europe or in the global north, but do we expect there will be the same type of the drivers in the global south? And which mechanisms may drive telecoupling and displacement of the land use caused by agricultural land abandonment? And if any other considerations also exist about filling these research gaps. With this, I would like kind of to thank you and rather to open the floor for the potential discussion. So that presented this kind of the theoretical understanding of the drivers and also potential existing research questions. But I also would be very happy to hear your insights about this process of abandonment, maybe your experience or maybe challenges, or which potential research gaps do exist. Yes. Thank you. If someone would like to unmute and engage in a discussion.
Hello, Dr. Alexander. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Qiming from National University of Singapore. First of all, thank you for the exciting presentation. I have one question. Is about the options for reusing the abandoned agricultural land. So in the last few slides, you mentioned there are several ways to reuse the abandoned cropland. So among these, which you think are the most feasible and common ones?
Well, thanks a lot. First of all, for your time that you decided to join, and to everyone, because exactly it brings a good possibility to discuss these topics. It's a really good question, and it requires me to think, because my first will be a perception, of course, if it will be context-based. Yeah, it can be context-based on what was before and what is expected after. And also sometimes I have a feeling what is the current agenda. So what is the those people who decide or who change, influence the people's mind. So also the cultural beliefs or some emotional beliefs. I work in quite some different parts of the world. In the past, I was working quite a lot and still continue in former Soviet Union countries, but I'm very happy also I did some work with the colleagues in Iran, in China, and also a little bit had some visit in South Africa to see these processes. And I think it's quite context-based, yeah, that then probably you may bring your experience, I don't know where you are working, maybe in Southeast Asia, sharing your experience, what will be useful. And it's very hard to tell because we need to measure consider a lot of things. I see among the participants, Alexander Forbrook, who is a cultural, I wouldn't say social geographer, social scientist, and he's working on a new forest in Russia. So we have a lot of abandoned lands in Russia. And nowadays, in fact, we have forests there. Even officially in the paper, it says that these lands are croplands or agriculture lands. So some lobbies in agriculture and political lobbies, they may be against of conversion of these areas to their forests. But nowadays, the forest may have a different connotation as important for carbon sequestration, also for commercial forestry. So depending also on a political context, depending also on the ability to promote maybe opportunities to improve their livelihood strategies, to diversify in agriculture areas, former agriculture areas, that may bring different types of the potential reuses of these areas. So for me, it's very hard to tell what could be the best way, maybe in tropical areas, perhaps maybe a natural recovery, but in long-term managed agriculture areas, if they are cultivated, probably there might be more possibilities to reuse what they can for the, let's say, with the natural reforestation, but rather controlled afforestation. This could be one way. It can be also used as a game areas or something else. If someone would like, to comment on that, I just rather a little bit hypothesize. I would be very happy if someone will try to also answer or to share opinion about the potential of the reuse of the abandoned lands.
Yeah, thanks for your exhaustive answer. And because I'm currently working on a research idea about how to about the trade-off and the potential options for us to reuse the abandoned cropland. So I'm stuck in the middle of like iron out the pathways for us to use this. Yeah, so that's why I asked this question. But anyway, I think your answer is quite inspiring. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe that's what brings really interesting way designing the work, because if you look through the literature, usually people consider one or two types of the possibilities, or the trade-offs, trade-offs between this and that. I've been engaged, was doing the work with the Patrick Mirfouaf into potentially available croplands with the different environmental costs with the recultivation of the lands. Of course, it was kind of a bit top-down approach. So we took the statistics and start hypothetically looking. But if you have possibility to have also bottom-up approach to run interviews, for instance, with the people, to engage with the stakeholders, but also to evaluate the policies, then you will get more insights and more possibilities to bring plausible trajectories of the reuse of these lands. So I would not say that to place too many, but maybe also not to use just maybe one or two.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. I just would like, maybe to warm a little bit up the discussion. We still have some time. When you define abandonment, how do you define, in terms of the time? When you study abandonment, so what is, in your context, agricultural abandonment? If you study the process, it's the question to everyone. Do you place some temporal definitions? Do you place how vegetation appears, or ability to distinguish? Let's say if someone uses remote sensing techniques. So what kind of the information, or what kind of your rules to define that this land is not cultivated?
For me, it's 5 year. I follow the FAO standard. Is it 5 year, 5 consecutive year of non-managing? That's my rule of identifying the abandoned cropland.
Okay. And I have a question. So if you work in a more also challenging, if you work in the systems, let's say tropical systems, so south of China or some other areas similar, and if you have cultivation, couple of the crop rotations, a year, crop cycles. If you have a reduction of the crop cycle, instead of the two, just having one, would it be considered also to certain degree abandonment or not?
Oh, that will be tricky.
No, there is no, how to say, answer. I just come through some literature. Sometimes I say that, but it's showing another dimension of the how to say, complexity to study these processes, right? That we may have some kind of the decrease of the intensity. It could be also to a certain degree considered as abundant.
Yeah, it will happen. I think it will cause misclassification in the maps, right? If this situation you mentioned occurs.
If someone else also can share from other parts of the world how they define if the land is not cultivated, maybe someone has not necessarily a timing, looking at the timing, but rather how does this appear in the ground. I know that, for instance, soil scientists, they use a shovel. Yeah, they take a sample, and by looking at the soil profile, I can tell a lot. And some people, they can look through the vegetation and already have a very good experience, like a botanist, what kind of the species composition to tell how long the field was not cultivated.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm from Moscow State University. And as you mentioned, I'm a soil scientist, and we study land abandonment in Smolensk region. So we, as well as remote sensing, we use field observations when we choose our sites to study abandonment. And as you said, yes, we look at the soil profile to see if the soil was actually cultivated in the past, because there can be certain uncertainties in remote sensing data, and especially when we compare historical maps to the remote sensing nowadays, and as well as we work with biogeographers, and as well as vegetation changes, we observe soil changes to say, does the plowing horizon still exist in the soil profile, or does it not?
Wow, this was really a good approach. It sounds because you use an expert knowledge from different angles, yeah, of the science. That's to have more confidence about abandonment.
Yes,
that's probably
of our studies to find some indicators, as well as in vegetation, in soil, maybe chemical composition, and in soil profile, to say what are the marks of land abandonment in soil and vegetation. So if we go to the forest, can we say by the look of it that it was plowed in the past?
Yes, that's a really good example. Yeah, well, again, if there are some good research grants which allow to do so, that's really great. But this could be a relevant approach. From my experience, that was also once a really nice way. Once I was in the field in Kazakhstan, and there was exactly one scientist, soil scientist, stood with a shovel, and then botanist, and then with the satellite data, and we had a very good agreement about this timing with the abandonment. But quite often we are probably a little bit, how to say, limited on that. That's, of course, brings a really important, valid question. I mean, that we work on the study sites, how to also compare these processes and through different areas. If we make some synthesis and contrasting the processes in terms of the timing and speed and intensity of the abandonment. I just would like maybe if someone also working and has some experience from the social science or cultural geography perspective of reading these landscapes. Olga, you mentioned that, but maybe someone else is in our group who has this type of the experience.
Hey, Alexander, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, this is Laura, calling from Germany. I just returned from Morocco from fieldwork, and I guess I come a bit new to the abandonment topic, but what came to my mind there is that a lot of farmers told me they stopped farming because of drought. So they stopped using the land for agriculture. But I guess you could ask about abandonment sort of also from an emotional and tenure side, right? So I was thinking, even though they stopped farming, they wouldn't have said they abandoned the farmland. They talked very much about being emotionally attached to the land. You know, it's their home, it's the family owns the land. So I guess you can't study that with remote sensing, but I would think it's very relevant to talk to people about, yeah, those ties to land, and from which point would they say they have abandoned the land, and at which stage, yeah, you know, where's sort of the cut emotionally and in a cultural relation to the land rather than just the physical use.
No, that's absolutely a relevant topic, and I believe there is exactly one of the maybe it's my biased opinion, it's one of the existing research gaps, because if you look at the literature, maybe it will be quite disproportional that a lot of work, you know, the satellite data, that's something what is available, you can measure, but to read this and to understand this impacts on the livelihoods, it requires very different approach also to go into the ground. You have to talk to the people and to understand, to link this process. And that actually brings, maybe we may organize this kind of one of the webinars on this cultural landscapes and maybe attainment to this lands. We have few people in our group, also from the participants, and be also filled as a potential maybe a working paper at some point about cultural factors in connection to the land.
Alexander?
Yes,
Can you hear
Torben,
me?
it's very,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Torben Birch Thompson, and I'm from the same group as Alex and Laura. So, but I just wanted to add to the comment made by Laura. I mean, I think very often people may have various reasons for certain periods not to possibly cultivate the land, and I think it's I mean, some of us have worked with shifting cultivation, and in some cases I did some work in northern Zambia with where you could have up to 30 years of fallow. Similar on Borneo with the Iban people in former days. I mean, they would have very long fallow periods, and they will never ask that they abandon or tell you that they abandon the land. They say we'll leave it, and then they keep using it, but for different purposes. So in the regrowth, they will have a number of other uses of the land for forest products, non-cultivated forest products. Some of the perennial crops that they may have grown, they can continue go and harvest and so on. But seen from the satellite, you will see that nothing is now going or happening in this land. So I think it's and it's not really under researched. I think there's a lot of research on only we don't use the word abandonment. It's a fallow, and you have fallow of different. And in Africa, they say that now the field has to rest. So they say they talk about that the field is resting because it's tired, or I mean, meaning low nutrients and so on. So it's actually, in terms of ecosystem services, I mean, it's a regeneration of the biomass, vegetation, fertility of the land, and so on. So a lot of things are going on, and on this, what you would call abandoned land. So I think that's at least a challenge. I think that this approach of abandonment is facing this because a lot of what you have talked about has been researched for in many different contexts, but maybe not being called abandonment, but simply, and even any change in land use. I mean, that is that you leave maybe from cultivating annual crops to planting trees. In the southern highlands of Tanzania, there's been like this, what they call a forestry regrowth, mainly because of people investing in planting trees instead of cultivating land. So because it's a big business. So would we then say they abandoned agriculture? Well, it's just another crop, and it's a perennial crop. So it's for sure it's a different use, but so it's they're abandoning one type of use to maybe shift to something else. So I think, anyway, I think there are some challenges in the approach and the use of abandonment, and that calls for a very clear kind of definition of what. And I think leaving a land for 5 years, if that's what the international organizations call it, and then it's abandoned. I can have a good case from I got a paper to review on biofuels in Tanzania, and one of the points they were making was that the international organizations were really pushing for biofuel production in Tanzania because there was such a huge large portions of land that was just lying idle. And this paper was then looking at what does that mean, that land is lying idle, and realizing that what they classified as idle land was, one, it was land that was in some kind of a fallow rotation, longer fallow rotation. It was land that was used for pastoralism, and therefore it was not used for cultivation, and it looked like it was left, and so on. So there was a number of different of these issues and problems, and so we have to be careful about how we define what is abandoned and not. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. This is very relevant question, and not only question, the discussion about how this may potentially this impact the design, also the studies, and what is exactly happening, to read also landscapes, to understand the local mechanisms behind. But probably also you can link what are the political policies are placed there, because we may have one type of the policies in one country which may actually allow to grow the trees. And it's really great to hear about your experiences, first of all in Morocco, then in Tanzania and Zambia. For instance, in European context, we have possibility to, like Baltic states, they grow the trees. Yeah, they have a commercial forest plantation. But to my understanding, for instance, in Russia, it's not yet allowed to have plantations. It's both emotional, but also different perspectives. So that's something what unfortunately may determine even there might be existing demand. Yeah, that might be existing demand for this type of the certain activities. And that's also how different legislation, what kind of the mechanisms they bring. I should also mention that it's very emotional and sensitive topic, because similar to deforestation in some countries, lands, abandoned lands can be dispossessed. So even they also place their own definition sometimes why they have the years or 3 years, because if the land is not cultivated more than 3 years, then they can use this as a definition to start taking out this land from the farmer. And for instance, also bring an example from Russian official legislation states so or in some other countries. So that also brings a bit challenge to us to study this process, also how to run the interviews with the farmers if they would be willing to discuss that they don't cultivate certain land. So maybe to have some indirect ways of measuring how we can see that this land in fact is not cultivated. I don't know if you have any of this type of the experience in your studies. Maybe someone can share about that, or if someone run into the situation where this is becoming kind of the sensitive topic. I don't know if someone has this bottom-up approaches or running the interviews, talking about the lands which are not cultivated.
If I can, if you allow, I think there's in many cases when you ask people in an African context about how much land they will cultivate, they will make sure not to say. They might not mention. They will mention what they cultivate, but probably not what they are at present not using, and that's basically because in East Africa there could be these systems where if you leave your land uncultivated, then for a certain period, then a village government would be able to come and reclaim that land to give it to somebody else, because there's a pressure on a need for land for new households and so on. So there could be cultural or political or whatever pressures that makes it this a critical or difficult question just to answer. It's the same as asking a pastoralist about how many cattle he has. You'll never get the right number, right? Unless you go and count all the cows. So I think that's these kinds of uncertainty is there.
Thank you, Torben. You have really strong expertise, deep expertise through your career and working with the in the ground also, in the countries, in this different systems, agricultural systems, also in the global south. We probably, if someone would like to say or share the experience or some impressions, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, we will start maybe slowly wrapping up. And at the same time, I highly encourage to become a member of this group. And if you have some ideas, also you would like something to present or discuss within the context of this group in upcoming months, then please send me a message. And we will anyway establish the network to communicate some relevant information. Okay, let me also ask you, if you wouldn't mind, we will recording this presentation, and we can place also on the YouTube. If you would mind, just send the message, then we will not do so. Okay, then thanks for your otherwise time. And if you have some questions, any ideas to discuss, please don't hesitate to contact me or some other, also the colleagues or the coordinators. And I also encourage you to have possibility to communicate among each other, because some you may have similar interests and also working in certain areas and certain topics, and we will make some kind of also a small database among the working group members, where the people are working and what they are studying, that get exactly to stimulate some communication and supporting each other. Otherwise, I would like to thank you, and we probably see you in some time. Enjoy your day or evening or your morning, depending where you are.